Hello lovely people, welcome to another book chat, the weekly roundup of stuff I've read at some point in my past. I have 4 things to talk about this week. Shall we crack on with it?
Sophie Vlogs.
The first book I want to talk about is The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. I absolutely adored this book. This was a 5-star read for me. I very wrongly said in the hall in which I hold this that it was a middle grade book. In my defence, last time I was in a physical bookshop, it was shelved in the children's section. Probably more of a YA, now that I have read it. Because although this starts off when the main character Michael is a child, it follows him as he grows up and ends up going to university, and there are definitely some topics in this which are more suitable to like a YA audience than a middle grade audience. I now know that. He's half Jamaican, half Greek. He's a black British boy, and it sort of follows his journey with like his sexuality and then growing up and dabbling in drag. The Black Flamingo is his drag persona. I'm sure you don't need me to describe this to you because I know that this has been doing the rounds and it's been immensely popular and immensely well received, and I think for absolute good reason. I absolutely adored this. I read it in, I think about like 24 hours, 2 days at the most. Because it's told in verse, it's one of those books that's such an easy read. You can fly through it really quickly, and I really think that it benefited from being able to just like dedicate solid chunks of time to reading it and just immersing myself in it and having this really like quick yet intense reading experience. One thing that I found really interesting is the narrative is told in verse, but then there are also parts which are poems that Michael's writing, or there are text messages, so there's like a little bit of like a mixed media format. And I found it really interesting, the contrast between the verse narrative and the poems. So the poems are in many ways like a continuation of this narrative, but also they are like this little like separate thing. And something about this managing to do verse, but then verse in like 2 different styles. You have your narrative verse, and you have like Michael expressing himself in poetry verse. I just found that quite interesting, and I really liked that sort of mix. I mean, the thing I loved most about this was all of its messages of, like exploration and finding yourself and accepting yourself. And there's like a poem that Michael performs very near the end that I found like really moving. I essentially like wept at the end of this book because there's this one poem that's all about like acceptance and that sort of thing, and I was just like, I imagined a younger version of myself reading this, even though like a younger version of myself didn't realise that I wasn't straight. But still, I think that it's wonderful that there is this book that a lot of young people who are exploring their identities and coming to terms with their identities will be able to read and find some like measure of themselves in, and I really liked that. There is so much more about this book that I could talk about. I feel like sometimes it's easier to be like objective and critically review a book when you have like mixed feelings on it, or you're like a bit neutral because you have like the space to look at it from a distance and be like, here are some strengths, here are some weaknesses. This one I just loved so much that I find it a bit hard to have that like critical distance, because I'm just like, it was wonderful. I loved every moment of it. These like struggles with like not just the exploration of one's sexuality, but the exploration of Michael's identity. He's brought up by his mum, who is Greek, and there is partly because of the distance between him and his father, because his father isn't really a person who's involved in his life. So there's occasionally like this disconnect with like the black side of his family, although like I will say I really loved how much people like his uncle and stuff was there for him. But then equally, he goes on holiday with his mum and visits his mother's side of the family, who are Greek, and there's again this disconnect there because he doesn't speak Greek, and there's this like multifaceted identity and navigating how much you connect to things slash feeling disconnected from things and stuff like that. I found that really interesting. I also really quite liked the interpersonal conflicts, which is a fancy way of saying the fallings out that he has with friends. This like snapshot of what sort of like childhood friendships are like, and then teenage friendships are like, and going off to university and trying to make friends, and then the bonds you have with people that you like don't go to the same university with and stuff like that. Like, this all felt very like recognizable to me. It all felt very like authentic to me, and I just thought it was really wonderful. And I probably need to go and read everything else that Dean Atta has written, and I thought it was great. Next up is a graphic novel. This is Once and Future Volume 1, The King is Undead by Kieron Gillen, Dan Mora and Tamara Bonvillain. This was fabulous. I really enjoyed everything this was playing with. So this is essentially like a group of nationalists try and wake up King Arthur, and shenanigans ensue. Let me just go through all the things I loved about this. Number one, this has that thing where sometimes books that are set around where you live just become extra delightful because you know everywhere they're talking about. So this is set around like Bristol, Bath, Glastonbury, all places that I know very well. And that was a delightful aspect. I also really loved this lady right here. This is Bridget Maguire. She's a retired monster hunter. I have said before, I really want like books with older female protagonists. So I loved that this is like, I think she's based on the fact that she's like living in a care home and stuff like this at the time. I'm going to say that she's roughly about like 70 or something. She was badass. She has like a no-nonsense attitude, that sort of thing, and I thought she was a cracking character. I loved it. Her grandson is like a bit more of that like bumbling sort of new to the world thing, so it was fun to have that sort of like dynamic of like older, like doesn't take any shit person along with the like person baffled by everything that's going on but kind of just running with it. Another detail that I really liked is this group of people very early on raise King Arthur from the dead. There's this idea that like King Arthur will return at England's darkest moment, but this raises the question of what if King Arthur returning is the darkest moment, which was really fun. There's the people who raise him from the dead like forget, like this posits Arthur as like fighting against the Saxon invasion. So when some of the people who've raised him from the dead turn out to have Anglo-Saxon heritage, that doesn't go down very well, does it? No, because he's King Arthur for the English, if you will. But like back at the point when this is positing that myth, that's like the Celts, which was a fun exploration and a nice acknowledgement. Another thing I really loved about this is it does one of the things that I really like in media, which is looking at the power of storytelling. So this raising of this figure is so influenced by the myths and the stories, but also this acknowledges that there are many different strands of Arthurian myth, and that you can, depending on your side, be playing around with those strands. You just have to, rather than find the one version of King Arthur that is truth, you have to just like pick the version of King Arthur's story that's going to aid what you want to do, whether that is try and stop this from happening or try and aid this from happening. There are many people in this who are playing with narrative, who are playing with storytelling, but in like a very serious way in which like the whole world depends on it type thing. I just thought that this was doing so many really fun things. The artwork was really cool, actually. I really liked the artwork. I'm trying to show you a page that's not a massive spoiler, which is easier said than done. Let's just show you this. Like, it's colourful, it's dynamic, I really enjoyed the art style. I just had a thoroughly good time. There is a part 2 that's coming out at some point. It's not released as of recording, but it might be as of posting, and I really do want to get my hands on it because I really do want to know how this story goes and how it finishes, because I've been loving everything it's playing around with. My final 2 books are both non-fiction. They vary wildly in length. Let's go short then long. So, penultimate book is The Last Duel by Eric Jaeger, a true story of crime, scandal, and trial by combat in medieval France. This is kind of like a case study of the final duel to the death that took place in medieval France. I think it did a really good job at doing what it was doing. So it's a very small little book, and what it does is this great mix of exploring this particular case study, but then also giving you some just general knowledge about both medieval France, duels, that sort of thing. It does a really great mix of giving you all the context and the information you need to like set the scene and make you feel immersed, and then also really with the way that it's exploring this one case study, he's telling it as if it's like a narrative, so you're sort of like taken through it as if it is happening before you, but also in a way that acknowledges that he is drawing on sources and in some cases slightly speculating. So like potentially at the duel itself, there is like a woman who is involved in this case who is like watching on, and he tells you what we know about the situation, like the fact that she was present, the fact that she had to be in this particular place, and what would have happened to her if X happened or if Y happened, like the specifics that we definitely know. And then there is like a little bit like at the edges of like wondering how she would have felt, that sort of thing. So you're like immersed in like not just the facts, but also like the emotions of it, which I found really fun. This final duel to the death that happened is one of those situations where it's like, we don't actually know which party was in the right. So he does a quite good job of laying it out for you very clearly and going into a lot of like breakdown of, okay, here is X person's version, here is this person's version, what do we actually know that definitely happened, what is all supposition, and at the end of it all he does sort of go through and be like, okay, like here is where a lot of popular history has sort of gone on this view for a while, but here are like my thoughts and stuff like this. So he's quite good at separating out what we know from what is his guessing. The final thing I will say is that I also think this did a really great job of building up tension. By the time we had explored the case fully and we were about to get to the actual duel, because the duel was put off, there were a bunch of reasons that happened that the duel kept being delayed. By the time we finally got to the showdown between these guys, and he's narrating the duel that they had, I was so on edge. Like, I was like, I kind of ended up having a person I was rooting for, because I was like, I kind of feel like maybe you're in the right, even though I don't know for sure. But then just the way he narrated it, it was so tense. I was like, I had to ignore everything that was happening. I was like, I just need to find out who's gonna die, okay? Maybe they'll both die. I don't know. But I was so hooked. So I actually ended up really enjoying this. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars because I feel like it did what it set out to do really well. Right, the final non-fiction book is a little bit of a chunker. This is The Romanovs by Sebag Montefiore. This is like his look at the Romanov dynasty who ruled Russia. I would like to say going into this, I do not have a lot of Russian history knowledge. There are like tiny little bits that I know some stuff about, but I would in absolute no way consider myself an expert. As such, there will be an aspect of me reviewing this where like I can't comment on how accurate and how correct his portrayal of these figures is, because I don't have any other reading that I can compare it to. So I can't really comment on like how true to these characters is his characterization of these people. I will say this was a wild read. I feel like he potentially... this is one of those things where I'm like, I don't know if I have enough knowledge to say this correctly. I feel like he might have chosen to highlight a lot of the more salacious details. At the same time, I'm like, maybe this is just how it was, you know? Like, there was a surprising number of assassinations, and also a surprising number of, not just affairs, but, like, people just, like, affairs to the point of, like, women having other men's children than the men that they were married to, and all stuff like this, and I was just like, and then there was just, like, a lot of, like, anecdotes and stuff that I kept having to stop myself from like telling my partner because he also wants to read this book, and I was like, I don't want to ruin the book for you, but I also really want your reaction to this piece of information. So that certainly made this very readable in that respect. There was a lot that was going on that was like quite salacious, and I was like, wow, cool. At the edges, sometimes I did wonder if I was necessarily being given the fullest vision of some of these people. Like, for example, God, I know so much about one of their sex lives. He would not stop quoting from their letters to each other. But I was equally like, there must be more to this man than just this. At times I did wonder if maybe I was being given the elements of history that show these people as, like, not incompetent, but, you know, their weaknesses. And occasionally I was like, surely they must have had some strengths. One thing I will say about the narrative is I felt like this could have done with a little bit of an edit. Specifically in regards to footnotes. It felt like nearly every page had footnotes, and sometimes these footnotes were really helpful. Like, sometimes they were really explaining, like, one was about, like, how the actual court is structured and stuff, and I was like, yes, thank you, this is really useful information for me to know. A lot of the time, the footnotes, did not actually relate to the sentence that they were coming off of. I would interrupt my sentence to read the footnote because I assumed it was related to the sentence I was reading, and then it was nothing to do with it. And B, was just not actually useful to this. I was already being given so much information that sometimes these footnotes, I was like, I don't also need this information, bearing in mind it hasn't got anything to do with what you're talking about. And I sometimes felt like, I know that he knows this so well, and I recognise that. I just felt like maybe I didn't need to know all of it. But then that's what this is. I recognise that this is like a chunky intro to the Romanovs, But it was like all of the side people, like, this happened to this person, blah, blah, and I was like, great, but not relevant to what you're telling me right now, so could we stick on the one topic so that I can keep with it? Also, a final thing I will say is that I did not always love the way that he talked about things. Some of the wording he uses to refer to things, whilst I recognise potentially accurate to the time he's describing, given that it's not directly quoting people from that time, I think you could have found better ways to talk about things. For example, referring to people as freaks. I think you could find a nicer way to talk about that. There are also more specific words that I felt like maybe should not have been used, and we could have had some more, like, contemporary wording rather than, That said, I do feel like I got from this what I was wanting, which was a better understanding of Russian history and the Romanovs. I also watched The Last Tsars on Netflix while reading this, which I also felt was really helpful. He was a contributor to that as well. I just feel like I had like a really intense week where I read this book and I watched The Last Tsars and I was like, oh, Russian history. If you are a person who knows a lot more about Russian history, I would be interested to know if you have any recommendations of books to read, because I did find this really interesting. I have nothing else to compare it to. It would be quite fun to read some other things and then sort of be able to, build up multiple strands of people's interpretations of history rather than just relying on this one. But yes, those are all the books I wanted to talk about this week. As for usual, have you read any of these? I would love to hear your thoughts on them if you have. Also, if you'd like to share a particularly good non-fiction history book that you enjoyed, that would be fun. I feel like we had quite a bit of that in this week's roundup. But yes, otherwise, I hope you're having the loveliest of days, and I will see you next time for something different.